guys, it's Nikki. This is my first video filmed post-isolation release, and so my husband was able to help me, so the focus is going to be better than anything I could ever have done by myself. I know this because I've tried it before and I do shitty. Anyways, I'm here today to do a spoiler-free review of... my spoiler-free review of The Stand by Stephen King. It is a chonker of a book, and I haven't read it in probably 4 or 5 years. I read it again based on what I remember thinking of it as a teenager, because I loved this book as a teen. If you had asked me then, I would have said 5 out of 5, best book ever, because I had it when I was about 15, 16, I was on a huge Stephen King kick. While I've read it more recently, I don't really remember what the change from when I read it as a teen to now is, and as it stands right now, it is one of my favorite kind of plague-induced post-apocalyptic situations to read about. This situation is played out by having multiple perspectives from all sides of the story, moving the story forward, interacting, and both reacting to the fall of civilization and then its rebuilding. And remembering this and remembering how much I loved it when I was about 15, I was super pumped to pick this up yet again, really. I know I've read it multiple times, but I didn't remember what my recent reads were like. And so I'm just going to move into the likes and dislikes here, just to give you an idea of, now that I have reread it, where I'm sitting with it. So my first like is the bulk of the pacing. The ending is a little iffy, but the majority of the book is just very well paced. You constantly move forward and rebuild the world after the fall. Like, the fall of civilization is reasonably quick. It does take up a good chunk of the book, but it does a really good job of setting the stage. And then the bulk of the book is rebuilding. And that was just done in such a way that you knew what kind of people you were dealing with, what kind of society they were getting set up, what was driving them. You got such a good sense of their motivation that I think wouldn't have come across had the pacing been different than what it was. My second like is the use of multiple perspectives. And this played a very similar role to the pacing. It ended up allowing for the world to be a lot more detailed and a lot more vibrant and filled out. There were some things that were unexplained, but the bulk of what was explained in the book just did such good things for establishing the people, the world, their reactions, their interactions, and what the greater kind of sense of the story was. And my third like is actually one that is really specific to this read-through, and it was the progression of the disease on society. The plague that resulted in this post-apocalyptic situation had a lot of different effects. I mean, there's the obvious, because it's post-apocalyptic, people clearly die in the story. This isn't a spoiler. They talk about on the synopsis of this book that this is a plague-based story. Anyways, back to my original point. You see the physical effects of people getting sick and dying, but then you see the psychological effects on the survivors. And I think that was really intriguing, and how the characters interact and move the story forward was really intriguing. And specifically to this read-through, I related to the survivors a little bit more, because as I had mentioned in like a previous update video, I was in isolation because I had a positive COVID exposure. And so I spent 2 weeks waiting to get sick, and I didn't get sick. And so I related to a lot of the main characters a little bit more, and I feel like I got a lot more out of the story, out of that part of the story specifically, than I have in previous readings. So it was added a very interesting depth to my enjoyment of this read-through. Now I'll move to the negatives. The first negative is kind of the mysticism aspect. And I think some people would really enjoy this. Just me specifically, some of the ways it was brought up kind of made me roll my eyes a little bit and pulled me out of what I kind of saw the story being. But this is a very specific, very personal opinion. And I recognize that a lot of people probably will think differently than me. My second dislike is also somewhat of a warning to people. There's very graphic and like gratuitous sex, some of it being very violent. And it was very disturbing. And I know that Stephen King does include a lot of weird sex stuff in some of his other stories, but this specifically was just very dark, and I had a very, very hard time getting through it. Of those scenes specifically. I had a hard time going through those scenes specifically. And then my final negative is that I found the last kind of like 10% or a little bit less of the book to be like unnecessary, because we had what I felt like was resolution, and then it just kept going. But to me, this is just part of Stephen King not really having great endings all the time. This part was kind of where the pacing fell off, the writing and characters kind of fell off the bus for me, because I felt like we'd hit a point where that's where I wanted the story to end, and it kept going and adding things that I just didn't enjoy or need in my read. Next, I'll bump up to the characters. I don't have a lot to say here, other than that I liked them. I found the multiple point of views were really effective in establishing the world, establishing relationships, and like just giving you a really good idea of who each person was. The cast was very eclectic, and while I wouldn't necessarily say it was particularly diverse, you did get a lot of difference in thought, and each character was very uniquely done. I ended up really liking a lot of the characters. It seemed to really matter what side of which side they were on in terms of good and evil, but there were also a few that I didn't care for. For the most part, I like people, like, say, Franny. I like Franny, but there's a few things that come up that just I don't care for. But overall, the characters were just very solid in here. This is, in my opinion, some of Stephen King's best character work. Which leads me to do a wrap-up. Having read it again, I still really, really like this book. The few things that I didn't like are definitely keeping me from giving it a 5 out of 5, unlike Teenage Nikki would have done, which is fine. And I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 this read-through, because as with all my positive and negatives listed before and the little bit I mentioned with the characters, overall this is just a really good book. The characters are solid, the setting and situation are very vivid because they're well explained from multiple perspectives to give you a really all-encompassing view of the situation. The pacing is predominantly just really good, with bad pacing affecting only a small portion of the book. I would still recommend this book to people if you're looking for like a really interesting adult take on a plague-driven post-apocalyptic event, because I do think overall it was really well done. I would just give 2 warnings. The first one, and most important one, being there is very graphic, gratuitous sex in it, as I mentioned before, so tread carefully if you are really sensitive to that. And then another more minor kind of very opinion-specific thing would be the mysticism related to it. To me, it just added an extra element that I didn't care for. It wasn't enjoyment breaking in the grand scheme of things, it just pulled me out of certain parts of the story. And other than that, that's all I really have to say. I mean, I could ramble on forever about each specific character, but I'm not going to do that here. I will try not to do it in my spoiler review that's going to follow this. And with that, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.